Welcome back. So we're a week into the season. It's far too early to decide who does or doesn't make the playoffs, but I've seen plenty of comments from people saying this team is, this team's not. Clearly, they're not built for the playoffs. Clearly, this team's going to win the cup. And it's insane. But I want to talk about four teams that are 3-0 to start the season, three teams that are 0-3, and a team that's 0-4. And there's some mild surprise on either side of this board. We'll start off with the teams off to good starts. So the Dallas Stars are 3-0. They have 13 goals for, 3 goals against. Their power play, 30%. So if they can keep it up around 30%, they're going to have an excellent record. Their penalty kill currently sitting at 92.9%. So honestly, the numbers from Dallas are great across the board. Now, they beat Nashville twice by scores of 4-1 and 5-1, and then beat Winnipeg last night 4-1. So they've allowed 1 goal in each game they've played. Now, their upcoming schedule, it gets a little bit tougher. They're at Toronto next. Then they go to Montreal. They go to Ottawa. They go to Boston. So it's a 4-game road trip. Boston may very well be an interesting one because Boston's on the board as well, right? But I think the odds of them coming out of Toronto, Montreal, and Ottawa without at least a single loss or an overtime loss, I think that's probably a lot to hope for. I think they probably suffer their first loss in those first 3 games. And then after the 4-game road trip, they come home and play against the Washington Capitals. Interesting, noteworthy performer thus far, Mason Marchment. 3 goals, 2 assists, 5 points in 3 games. That's pretty good. That's an 82-goal pace. That's on pace for well over 100 points. I don't expect him to keep that up. I also don't expect Dallas to go undefeated this year. But it is good to get off to that kind of a start, right? Now, again, noteworthy is that they've just beaten Nashville and Winnipeg. So one thing that we can say about these early records is that strength of schedule really hasn't come into it yet. And that brings us to Boston. Boston's 3-0 on the season. They've scored 16 goals. They've allowed 8. Of the 4 teams that are currently 3-0 in the NHL, they've allowed the most goals. Their power play, 22.2%. Very good. Their penalty kill, 90.9%. Again, when you add up power play and penalty kill together, any number higher than 110 is considered to be fantastic. Their record got to 3-0 by beating the Washington Capitals 5-2, beating Arizona in a bit of a scare 6-3, and then beating Florida last night 5-3. Very impressive game by Ullmark that gets them the win. Now, their upcoming schedule, well, they're at Ottawa next, but then they come back home. They're at home against Anaheim, Minnesota, Dallas, and Detroit. So Boston, honestly, their schedule is not that bad to start the season, and they could build up, I would say, out of the next 5 games, another 3 or 4 wins? Quite possible. And we could be talking about them as at the end of October as being one of the top teams in the East. AJ Greer stands out to me with 2 goals, 2 assists for 4 points. No clue how long this goes. It is a fast start that's a holdover from having a pretty good preseason. And that's for people who say, well, the preseason doesn't matter. In general, no, but for some individual players, it does. Then we get to Carolina, who are 3-0, might be the best of these 4 undefeated teams. They've scored 11 goals. They've allowed 3. Their power play sitting at 20%. Their penalty kill, usually excellent, 91.7%. They get here by a 4-1 victory over Columbus, a 2-1 victory over San Jose, and a 5-1 victory last night over Seattle. So they haven't defeated a team or played a team yet that made the playoffs last year. But Carolina was already favored to be one of these top teams in the NHL. And having a relatively easy schedule to start the season, I mean, that's a benefit to them. Now, this road trip is going to get interesting from here. They go to Edmonton, they go to Calgary, and then they go to Vancouver. So it's kind of a weird trip in terms of how they've got this scheduled out. You think go Vancouver after Seattle and then over to the Alberta teams, but it's fine. After the road trip's finished, they then go home. They play against New York Islanders, and then they're out on the road for a game in Philadelphia. It's not an easy schedule upcoming. The 2 games in Alberta will be fun to watch and might give us a better idea for where Carolina's at right now and for where the Alberta teams are as well. Svechnikov has been a standout, 3 goals, 2 assists for 5 points in 3 games. I have said for years, I think Svechnikov, if he was a little more selfish and took a few more shots, he could probably be a 40-goal scorer or higher. The goal-scoring ability is there. So for Carolina, they've been very solid. Again, they haven't played a team that made the playoffs last year as of yet. Vegas, they're 3-0 on the season. 10 goals scored, 5 goals against. Their power play clicking at 25%, which is odd for a Vegas team. Vegas, their power play has been their weakness through most of their existence. Their penalty kill's usually been very good, and it's good again, 85.7%. So all 4 of these teams have really good special teams numbers, which shouldn't surprise anyone either. Their schedule, well, they've got Chicago and Seattle that they've already played as well. So for Chicago and Seattle, it's been a rough start to the season in terms of scheduling. For Vegas, they beat LA 4-3, then they beat Chicago 1-0, and beat Seattle 5-2. Their upcoming schedule will give us a better idea for where they're at. They're at Calgary next. That, of course, is tonight. Then they're at home against Winnipeg, at home against Colorado, and then Toronto comes into town before they go back on the road and they play San Jose. And, of course, Vegas-San Jose is always a fun game, although with a lot of the agitators that were on each side through most of that blood feud they had going, that might have settled down a lot this year. Jack Eichel with a goal and 2 assists does stand out. He is their leading scorer. I don't expect anybody in Vegas to get to 100 points this year, but if Eichel scores at a point-per-game pace throughout the season, that's a really nice bounce back from a down year last year. And of the 4 teams on the board, I think Carolina is the best of the 4. But again, we'll get a really good idea of where they're at once these next 5 games have gone by. Now we get into the winless, and again, I had to cut it off somewhere, so I thought teams that are off to 2-0 starts, great, but not talking about them today. And teams that are off to 0-2 starts, that's a shame. Looking at New Jersey, looking at like Calgary as examples of both sides of that. But we start off with the Canucks, who are 0-3. These standings I got in order from the NHL site. So, all right, I'm not going to pay attention to. And it is interesting, too, that Vancouver is winless and Boston and Dallas haven't lost a game yet. So, I should never have lost faith in my teams. But for Vancouver, they've scored 9 goals. They've allowed 14. So, it's been a sloppy 3 games. Allowing almost 5 goals per game, you're not winning anything that way. Their power play, 14.3%. Not good enough. Their penalty kill, 50%. What killed Vancouver's playoff chances last year was 2 things, a slow start and a brutal penalty kill. Now they're off to a slow start, and their penalty kill numbers are awful. So it's not encouraging to see them repeating the same mistakes they made last year. They lost 5-3 against Edmonton, where they had a lead. They lost 3-2 against Philadelphia, where they had a lead. And they lost 6-4 against Washington, where they had a lead. And these are multi-goal leads. You can't be losing these leads. Upcoming tonight, they're at Columbus, so one of these teams is going to have a win tonight, because somebody has to win. Then they go to Minnesota, another team that's on the board. So Vancouver could go 0-5 on this road trip. We're going to have desperate teams in Minnesota and Columbus. Vancouver's got to bring their A game, I think, for both. And then they come home and they play against Buffalo, who are on a long road trip. Their next home game is against Carolina, and then they go and play in Seattle. So for Vancouver, I look at this schedule, and there's a part of me that thinks, well, that looks easy. But when you look at each team that they're playing against, each team's very motivated. So there's not going to be an easy night, which we always say there's not easy nights in the NHL. There can be teams that are relatively not easy, but easier to defeat than others. But I don't think Vancouver's got that. Now, Pettersson with 2 goals and 2 assists. He's off to a good start offensively this season, but I don't think he'd be happy about the 0-3 record, right? So personal numbers are fine and great. He's above a point per game, but you look at the overall numbers, there's a problem. Minnesota, major problems in Minnesota. 0-3, 12 goals scored, 20 goals against. Major shift in the power rankings based on last night's game. And honestly, their special teams numbers show you've got a great part of this team with a 42.9% power play, but the penalty kill hasn't been good enough at 69.2%. So even though those 2 numbers add up to more than 110, you still want to improve that penalty kill, because that power play, it's not going to keep clicking at 42.9%. They lost 7-3 against the Rangers. Forgivable, right? Rangers, a contending team. 7-6 against LA. The problem with that one was every time they came back and they got themselves in the game, they shot themselves in the foot again. And then last night they lose 6-3 against Colorado. So they've lost to 2 teams that are very good, right? Whereas in Vancouver's case, I would say Edmonton's probably the best of the 3 teams they've played against. We'll see how good Washington is this year. Philadelphia is still expected to fall back, but they're off to a 2-0 start. Now, in Minnesota's case, Their next game is at home against Vancouver, so they've got some days off to try to fix this. Then they go to Boston, so that's not easy. They're at Montreal. Montreal doesn't look like they're going to be giving up anything easily. Then they're at Ottawa. Ottawa's a desperate team as well that would be on this board if they'd lost one more game. And then they're at Detroit. So 4 games in a row on the road after the next home game against Vancouver. It is key that they get that win over Vancouver before going out on the road. Matt Boldy has not been the problem. 3 goals, 2 assists, 5 points in 3 games. Excellent season for Matt Boldy. He's tied with Kaprizov with those totals. Then we get to Columbus. Of the 4 teams on the board, Columbus might be the most alarming. Why? They're 0-3, which is one thing, gets them on the board, but they've only scored 5 goals. And of those 5 goals, Johnny Gaudreau's been in on 2 of them. So they've only scored 3 times where Gaudreau wasn't involved. They've scored 5 and allowed 14. So much like Vancouver, they're allowing almost 5 goals per game. The difference being Vancouver scoring about 3 goals per game, whereas Columbus is not. Now, their power play is a 0. He can't be a 0. Their penalty kill, 71.4%. So when you're looking at tonight's game against Vancouver, even though they're a 0, their special teams add up to 71.4. Vancouver's are 64.3. So, yeah, it could be an interesting game tonight. In order to get here, they lost against Carolina 4-1. They lost to Tampa Bay 5-2, and they lost to St. Louis 5-2. So, the good news, if you're a Columbus fan, is they got beat by 3 teams that are pretty darn good. Carolina, contender. Yep, they're on the board right here. Tampa Bay, 3 times in a row they've been to the Stanley Cup final. Now, they're the only team Tampa's beaten in their first 3 games. Sure. But still, Tampa Bay's losses against Pittsburgh and against the Rangers, pretty good teams. And then St. Louis, of course, is always a playoff contender, usually one of the better teams in the Central. So the good news is they've played 3 pretty good teams. Their record's not where they want it to be, but they can turn it around. They're at home against Vancouver tonight, and then they've got Nashville, and then they've got Pittsburgh. So if they beat Vancouver, they get to 1-3. Between Nashville and Pittsburgh, if they win one of those 2 games, they're at least starting to dig their way out of this. And again, it's very early in the season. Then they're at the New York Rangers, and they're home against Arizona. But when you look at these next 5 games, and you realize, like, yeah, it's a long season, but then you're 8 games into the season, and if you're still stuck at like 1-7 or 2-6, something along those lines, the amount of points you have to put up after that for those other 74 games for the rest of the season, it gets ridiculous. And your points percentage has to be really quite high in order to get into the playoffs. And I think that's going to be the case in the East and West. It might take 100 points to get into the playoffs for both conferences this year. It was close to being 100 points for both, LA getting in with 99 last year. So Johnny Gaudreau leading the way for Columbus with a goal and an assist. It illustrates that Gaudreau's had a slow start as well. He's looked frustrated already at points. There are lots of players who've looked frustrated on these teams. But it is very early. And I think with this schedule, if they can win, Arizona, they should beat Arizona, right? They should beat Vancouver in this game tonight. They should be highly motivated. Now, Vancouver should be highly motivated too. Could end up with some fights out of that, right? But Columbus needs to turn this around. I picked them to make the playoffs. We'll see if that ends up being the case. And this is one of those times where, when people say, oh, aren't you upset that you were wrong? No, actually, I like that the league's not predictable. I think it's boring if you're watching hockey and everything turns out exactly the way you thought it would. San Jose, 0-4 to start the season. Of the 4 teams on the board, San Jose was expected to be here. They've scored 6 times, they've allowed 14. But they've played an extra game, so their goals against is still better than Columbus, Minnesota, or Vancouver. So that's a bonus. Their power play, 6.3%. That's low, but it's better than Columbus. And their penalty kill, 100%. So San Jose's penalty kill is still very good. They need to work on their power play. Then you look at the 4 games they've lost. They lost 4-1 to Nashville. They lost 3-2 to Nashville. Those games both in Prague. They were better in the 3-2 loss than the 4-1 loss, but those were legit losses. It's not like you could argue they should have won one of them. Carolina beats them 2-1, so that was close. And then Chicago beat them 5-2. And that was the tough loss. That was the one that I think stung the most. Chicago is supposed to be terrible this year. That's the expectation. And San Jose was ahead, and then all of a sudden they were behind. They allowed 2 shorthanded goals to Lafferty back-to-back. Dickinson had 3 points against them. So some head-scratching on that one. Their upcoming schedule, it doesn't get easier. They go to New York, they play the Islanders, then they play the Rangers, and then they play against New Jersey. Following that, they go to Philadelphia. So this could get a lot worse before it gets better. When they come back home, it's to play against Vegas first. So yeah, this could be a season where San Jose loses a ton of games. Tomas Hertl stands out to me. This is a guy who got a big extension, just the one goal so far for Hertl. He's not the only one on a long-term extension who's had a disappointing start to the season, or a long-term contract, I should say, who's had a disappointing start to the season. You could see Goudreau's numbers as an example. But yeah, Hertl they expected more from, and we'll see whether or not San Jose can turn it around. So the question I have for people watching this is simple. Which of the teams that are 3-0 do you think is most legit? Where you'd say, all right, this team is going to be that good all year. They're going to be very good all year. Which team that's winless so far is going to end up being really, really bad? I think the argument can be made for San Jose, and I think if Vancouver and Minnesota don't get their defensive struggles straightened out, they absolutely are going to be in that conversation as well. I'm shocked with how bad Vancouver's defense, passing, turnovers, all this stuff have been. For Minnesota, I mean, I didn't expect Fleury to be Vezina level, but the numbers have been ugly. And Gustafsson didn't have a great year last year, and I think the expectation was they'd play Fleury a ton, and it's not working out. So we'll see how it goes, but let me know which teams you think. Okay, and another question too, which team that's 0-3 do you think makes the playoffs? And if one of the 3-0 teams was going to fall out of the playoffs, why are you going to argue for Dallas? You might argue for Boston. But let me know your thoughts in the comment section below. As always, don't forget to hit like and subscribe if you're browsing your way through. You just happened upon this video. Thank you guys so much for watching, for all your support. I will talk to you again soon.